Good evening, Olivet Baptist Church. It's good to have you with us tonight and joining us online. We're grateful for your presence, and we want to spend a few moments at the beginning of our time together praying. And let me call your attention to the prayer list. Hopefully you got that from Kathy recently, and you can look at it. If you don't have one in front of you, I'll call your attention to some of the ones that are on the prayer list that we need to particularly mention. And let me start with a name on the list named Jasmine Payne. She's having cancer treatments and previously attended all of it and moved out of state. And then Gina Mills has COVID and is in a hospital in Florida. Always remember the people that are on the front lines, and I'm particularly thinking about doctors and nurses and all the medical professionals who help, people who drive ambulances, all kinds of folks. And then I'm thinking about teachers who are, if they're not already on the front lines, and most aren't just yet, they will be in just a few weeks, and they're going to be dealing with a whole new world. And so they'll be trying to do all kinds of things like wearing masks and having protective equipment and social distancing with children, all that kind of thing. And we need to remember all of the folks, even those in grocery stores, wherever they are. We want to remember folks who have to get out there and work every day and expose themselves to the coronavirus, and we're grateful for them and want to pray for them. Also, don't forget to pray for the family of Martha Cruz. She passed away a week ago last Sunday, and of course most of you, or perhaps all of you, know that she was a senior adult member of all of it and had been a member for over 47 years. One of our members now, Quint Smith, that was his grandmother, and they had a memorial service for her last Friday afternoon, and we're grateful for her life and grateful for her family, and we want to pray for them as well. And then don't forget to pray for our worship team. We've like I was last week away with family that wasn't here on Sunday morning. Some of our worship team's been gone, and I know some of the that have been gone are going to be back this week, and we're grateful that they'll be back with us, and want to thank the Lord for them, but also pray for them. They do some things that are incredible, and we're grateful for them as they lead us in worship in the music portion of the service. And then don't forget the Restart team. Pastor Jake and I sent out a letter last week that most of you saw about a scare we had with an old 4K teacher and thought she might have COVID, and yet that didn't happen. But we still had lots of emails back and forth trying to figure out what to do, because we didn't want to be caught flat-footed at the end of the week when we found out about the test, and we didn't want to fail to inform people appropriately. And that Restart team has been a great help to us, and we're grateful for them. And then also, please remember to pray for the pastor search committee. I've said this before, and it should be no surprise to anyone that when you get into this pastor search process for 7 months, which is what they're doing now, perhaps a little more than 7 months, and anytime you get to that stage, typically you're getting into a crucial period for the committee, and the group needs to be praying together and working together. And I know I met with them very recently. They're meeting regularly, and I want you to know they are working at it and praying together and working together. And we need to pray for them too. And we need to pray for not only for the search committee, but also for the pastor that God will bring here. I'm sure he already knows who that is, but he allows people like our search committee to be involved in the search process and figuring that out. And so we want to pray for them. Also, our deacons, they met last Monday night, and I was still away and didn't meet with them for the first time since I've been here. I think I missed a deacons meeting, but I'm grateful for them, and they're working through the deacon nomination process and leading us in that, and we appreciate them. And then also pray for O4K, their staff, and they're going through this COVID thing like the rest of us, and trying to deal with things that are new. And then finally, I want to mention to you, pray for Pastor Jake and the student ministry. They're doing a great job. We appreciate them, and just need to continue to pray for them. So I'm sure there are others that you're thinking about that we need to pray for tonight, and I just encourage you to join me as I lead us in prayer. Father, thank you for the time that we are allowed to have tonight to share together, even though it's in a virtual way. We just pray that you be with each one of these we've mentioned. There are some with cancer treatment and some who have lost a loved one, and certainly we want to pray for our frontline medical personnel, all all other personnel, teachers who either are already back at work or getting ready to go back in a new situation, folks who have COVID, and we've mentioned those tonight, and just ask you to be with all of these people in a very special way. Guide them, give them the wisdom that they need to be safe, give them sharp minds and clear thinking and great hearts to do whatever it is they need to do. We pray for our worship team and thank you for them, and we're grateful for the Restart team. Father, thank you for our pastor's search committee, and as Janet Cantrell leads that committee, we pray for her and for each of them, and help them to find the person you want to be here as the lead pastor at Olivet Baptist Church. And I pray that you'll prepare the search committee, but also be preparing the church and be preparing the pastor and his family, and just ask you to be with them and help them to feel your presence, help them to know that you're there, minister to them in the ways that they need. We're grateful for our deacons. We're grateful for Pastor Jake and the student ministry leaders, and ask you to give them all that they need as they serve in this vital role. Thank you, Father, for the opportunity we have to pray. Thank you for leading us and guiding us and being a part of our lives. Be with us now as we continue our study of the Book of Ruth. Help us to do that in a way that pleases and honors you. Help us always to follow the biblical text and truth, and help us know how this ancient text can be meaningful to us in these days that we never foresaw, but we know that you did. So God, help us discover your truths and apply them to our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, as I mentioned, we began, this is really our second week in the Book of Ruth, and we almost didn't get into the actual book last time. We spent a lot of time on the background of the book, and so there's so much background, and I know some of you may not be able to have been with us last week. Others, I can't believe it, but we might have forgotten some of it. So let me spend just a real few minutes going through some of the review of what we talked about last week that'll help all of us get on the same page as we look at the actual first part of the first chapter tonight in just a few minutes. First of all, it's important to see a historical or chronological picture of Palestine. What was going on historically in order about the time of this thing we call the Book of Ruth and when it was written? Well, it begins in verse 1 by saying it was it was during the when the judges governed. And to put that in a historical context, we need to understand that when the Israelites came out of Egypt and Moses led them, they wandered for a long time. And then as they entered the land, the promised land, and again, dates are hard to come by back then because we don't have a lot of history books that give us specific dates, and the Bible doesn't give us the kind of dates we're used to, at least. And yet we can track it. And at about 1250 BC to 1200 BC was when Moses left off and Joshua led the people to settle or have what it calls here the conquest of Palestine. And so the period of Judges was the next period of the people of Israel after they had been more or less settled for about 180 to 200 years. And the connecting factor there for them between the time of the judges, when the judges ruled, and you'll remember there were several judges. Othniel was the first one. Ehud was one of them. We haven't, most of us, heard of those. You may have heard of Deborah, who was a judge. She was a woman, obviously, and that's kind of special, and so that one you could have heard of, and maybe all of them. But then Gideon, that's one you probably recognize, and Samson, those are two that you might know. But those were some of the judges that reigned and ruled in various portions of this land we call the Promised Land or Palestine. And for these 180 years, those are some of the people who led and they were called judges. Then there was a guy who was really the last judge, and his name was Samuel, and we could talk a long, long time about Samuel, but he was a really special guy in the history of Israel, and he was really the connector, because not only was he the last judge, but he also was the one that God worked through to identify and even anoint King Saul about 1020, and then King David at about 1000. And when you get to King David's rule, you get to a little more specific dates. You'll notice there's not a question mark on the slide, and get a little more specific dates because we can track those a little better. But then David's son was Solomon, and then even though David and Solomon ruled over the combined kingdoms of Judah in the south and Israel in the north, those kingdoms split up again, and so they had different kings. One was Rehoboam, one was Jeroboam, and then we go on down the line. But that's the period of that's what happened around the period of the Judges, to kind of give you a historical context. And when it comes to the Book of Ruth, we oftentimes when we're studying a book say, well, when was that book written? That would be helpful to us, but we know that we really don't know when it was written. And a lot of times we say, well, who wrote that? Like in the New Testament, often the writer was Paul. And we can say, well, because it was Paul, we can understand these things, but we don't know who wrote. There's a lot of speculation about that. We do know the literary style is a short story. And we also know that it's a true story. Some, perhaps, I don't know that I've ever actually heard people say that, but with such a nice story and a beautiful story, a story that has such good lessons in it, some people might say, well, gosh, that looks like a parable, something that somebody made up to teach a lesson. And certainly Jesus told parables to great success. He was a great teacher, and one of the ways he taught most was through parables. But and there were parable tellers. There were parables in the Old Testament as well, but that's not what this is. This is a true story, and it's really a delightful story. And the purpose, at least some of us believe, the purpose was to exalt David by telling this beautiful story of people who were in his lineage, his ancestors, and that's where the book or the story of Ruth really ends in these 4 chapters that we're going to look at more closely. And as we look at the book of Ruth then, that gives us the background in a very quick way. But then as we look at the book of Ruth itself, we need to see what's actually in the contents there and what the story says to us. And the thing that I've thought about as I thought about an overview of what's this first chapter, or at least a portion of the first chapter, what would you call this? And I thought of the phrase, pretty as a picture. Now, what do you think when you hear that phrase? Pretty as a picture. Well, I don't know about you. I think of my granddaughter or some other little girl that's just pretty as a picture. But we also can think about a life, someone who has a life that's as pretty as a picture. And it could be that some people's life seems to be perfect. It is picture perfect, you might say. But when we know the tales of any life, we know that really there is no life that is perfect. Of course, none but one. But when we think about the torture he went through in another context, that he was perfect, but that wasn't perfect either, because he was ridiculed and all the rest. But in terms of what a perfect life would look like, none of us really lives a perfect life. 2 of the characters we're going to talk about in just a minute are Naomi and Ruth. And when you look at these 2 characters, these 2 people who lived during these days, you find, when you look back on it, that they had a wonderful life. Their life, you might say, was pretty as a picture. But when you look in detail, and when you look at as they went through it, it was a life kind of like ours. They had difficulties as they went through. But then there's a mental picture that might come to you of the book of Ruth itself. What is the book of Ruth? What's it like? Well, first of all, as we've already said, it's a beautiful story. And it's a simple story, really. Some people have called the book of Ruth, and I've heard this said about the book of John as well, or at least something similar to this, that it's a simple story. It's as if it's a stream where children can play, but it also has depth. It's a simple story with depth. A stream where children can play, or a rhino could swim. That's an interesting idea, I think. Some people have talked about Ruth and said, well, it's kind of like the Gaither songs. You know about them, don't you? Because they're real simple too. When I think of the Gaither songs, I think of many songs, but one that comes to mind is Because He Lives. I've used that as an illustration more than once as I've taught here at Olivet. I remember a couple times, and it's a wonderful, wonderful illustration of life. Because He lives, I can face tomorrow. That's really important. Because Jesus lives, we can face the difficulty that comes tomorrow. But there's another Gaither song that comes to my mind a long, long time ago. We had some folks come to our church and did a special, it wasn't really a revival, but it was just a special series of meetings that helped us come closer to God and help us come closer to each other. And I remember the theme song for the week that they used was Something Beautiful. I don't know if you've heard that song or not, and I won't try to sing it for you, but Something Beautiful. All I had to offer Him was brokenness and strife, the song says, but He made something beautiful of my life. And that's a wonderful, simple idea that has a great deal of depth. Not only is this a simple story and a beautiful story, but it's a story that deals with everyday folks. It's just common everyday folks. And one of the ideas here is not a major lesson, I don't think, but an idea that we need to keep in mind that comes from that is God moves through the greats. I don't know how much you've read about Augustine, but he was a great a long, long time ago. Zwingli, Luther, Calvin. When you get to Naomi, you think, wow, she's pretty great because she wound up in the Bible, but boy, at the time, she wasn't a great. She's just a plain, ordinary person. Think about Ruth, same way. And the good thing about that is, think about you and me. We're just ordinary folks, and God still works through us. And though, and we've already said this, but though scholars don't agree with who the author was, and sometimes, even though I've told you what I think the purpose is, we're not 100% sure. But what we do know and can agree on, that Ruth is a beautiful story about God working in the lives of real, simple folks, and we can learn from studying it about how He works and how to respond to Him and how to respond to others. Let me read for you just the first 13 verses of chapter 1 of Ruth. Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, don't forget that, and it's not just any Bethlehem because there's more than one, Bethlehem in Judah, some translations say Bethlehem Ephrathah, okay, went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. There's that word. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of the one was Orpah, not Oprah, but Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited His people in giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her. And they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant you, may the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, No, but we will surely return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? I have yet sons in my womb. The question, have I yet sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. Now, a lot there. Let's take it one step at a time. Let's talk about the characters first. You got some folks with them. Some of them have names that we're familiar with even today. Some are pretty weird in the 21st century. You've got, first of all, you've got Elimelech, which is an interesting name. He's the head of the household. Naomi is his wife. Their two sons are Mahlon and Chilion, two more names that aren't real familiar to us. And then the story unfolds. If you look at the plot or how the story unfolds, you'll see that what happens is they moved from Bethlehem, and that's interesting too. Remember when I was reading the passage when I said that these folks, that the writer wanted us to be sure we knew which Bethlehem there was. There was more than one Bethlehem, and then twice it referenced the Bethlehem in Judah. So we know what that Bethlehem is. That's a town that's not too far from Jerusalem, and we know who was born there later, don't we? So there's some symbolism there. So there's some things that might not be such a coincidence there. Also, it's interesting that the name Bethlehem means house of bread or granary of bread or place granary itself. And so as we look at that, it's ironic to have a famine in the house of bread, don't you think? That's pretty ironic. It happened, but it's kind of ironic that here you have the house of bread and there's a famine. This family that we've already named moved to Moab. Moab is a narrow strip of land that's east of the Dead Sea, and it's a pretty good land. It was especially good for sheep, and yet foreigners were not highly thought of in Moab, so it's kind of interesting that they apparently were greeted with some degree of acceptance. Now, Naomi's husband, Elimelech, died. And his sons, their sons, I should say, married Moabite women. But then they both died. All total, the way I understand the text, Naomi lived there in Moab for 10 years. And then, and if you remember what I read to you in the text, we won't go back to each verse, but then she heard somehow or another that, there's more bread, there's more food, things are going better back home. So she started home to Bethlehem. But then Naomi perceived God was punishing her. We're going to see more about that as we go on through the text, for at least for a while. But notice, and it's almost tongue-in-cheek, it seems like that she's saying to these daughters-in-law, you better go back. What am I going to have? More sons that you can marry? Well, she's not going to have any more sons. And if she did, they'd be a little young for these two to marry. So she's telling them to go on back. She's releasing them. And that's an important issue that we need to remember. And so even though she released them, we're going to find out later that they decide, or not they, but one of them decided to stay with her. And again, she perceived that God was punishing her. Now, there's something interesting that I want to call your attention to in the text here about her uh, losing her husband and her sons. What do you think it was like for uh, a person to, um, for a woman especially, to lose her spouse, her husband, in that day? How do you think that was? Well, you've probably heard me say before, we got to remember there was no Social Security, there was no such thing as life insurance. They had an issue. Women, were treated differently in those days. And so it was a devastating thing in those days, especially for her to lose her husband, and then her sons would normally take care of her. She lost her sons as well. But also something that's in the text that it's interesting to look at in verse 8. And it says there, and Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. Now, this is a very important concept that we need to understand. And the word here in the New American Standard is kindly. If you were to look at some other translations, for example, the Holman Christian Standard Bible uses another phrase called faithful love. But the translation from the original text is a word that is actually untranslatable. It's a strong term regarding relationships. And in that term, there's all kinds of concepts or ideas wrapped up in that. It includes so many attributes of God, things like love, mercy, grace, kindness, goodness, benevolence, loyalty, faithfulness. Basically, what to the Hebrew mind this idea of chesed meant, or hesed, depending on how you say it, and there's two pronunciations. This was the golden rule applied. It was looking at others and saying, I want to do something for that person's benefit without any thought or respect to the advantage that it might bring to me. Boy, that's uncommon these days. But what she was saying is, you've treated me with this kindness or faithful love, or if you use the original Hebrew language, it's a different word. But you've treated me and you've treated your husbands with this kindness or faithful love in such a way that you were obviously looking out for what was best for us instead of yourself. It might have been better for you to do something else. In fact, going back to Jerusalem with me would be considered that as well. That rather than you let me go alone, you travel with me and you go with me and you agree to stay with me, even though it would be better for you to go back and start fresh back home, it says here, with their mother. That's what she encourages them to do. I want to treat you the way you have treated me. I want to treat you as if I had no regard for my own benefit. I only was looking out after you. Wouldn't the world be a better place if all of us had that kind of idea and if all of us treated each other that same way? And then I want to also, before we get into the actual lessons here, I want to just look at Naomi's thought about how the Lord, in verse 13, no, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. Now, that's all Naomi can see at the time. But as I look at the text, you wonder why she believes that. Well, one is, some people might say, well, there were laws against intermarriage and all that. But as I've looked at that carefully, number one, that really has gone on by. There were some restrictions that they weren't supposed to intermarry with others, but that was down to the 10th generation, and this is beyond that time. And so, in other ways, if you look at the law, it was about men marrying women versus the other way around in some cases. So that's not really a factor, even though some people might still say that it is. I don't believe that's a factor. Also, when you look at the end of the book of Ruth, and we don't want to spend much time there, but you almost can't understand the beginning of the book of Ruth unless you understand what's at the end. So if you want to turn to the end, you're going to find that Ruth is going to wind up having a baby. Now this is Ruth, who is Naomi's daughter-in-law, who was married to Naomi's son. Okay, she gets remarried after her husband has died. She marries someone else back in Jerusalem. And we're going to see that she has a baby, and that baby winds up being the ancestor of David, King David, who winds up being the ancestor of Jesus. And so as you look at that, it's not possible, really, for this to be a punishment of God for those reasons. And we need to understand that. But whether she was thinking about those things, which I don't think she was, or she just was kind of had that natural thought that, you know what, something bad happens to me, God must be punishing me. God must be punishing me. Or we might look at someone else and say God might be punishing them. So I don't, even though she says that here, and even though it's biblical that she said it, and she did have that attitude, there are many things in the Bible that people say or do that aren't necessarily according to what the reality is. You know, Job's friends, for example, told him all kinds of ways that he'd done something wrong. You must have done something wrong. If you messed up, well, it wasn't true. And that's the way I think this is. If you look at it that way, she thought because she'd been through a difficult time in her life, she must have done something wrong. Well, certainly she did things wrong. Certainly she was a sinner, just like you and I. At the same time, it was not necessarily a punishment from God because she'd done something wrong. And that's what's often is seen. And that really leads us to the first life lesson here. And that is, do not prejudge others. Whether it's a person like Naomi, or maybe you, or Ruth, or someone else, or your neighbor, don't prejudge them. Or if it's a group like Moabites, there would have been plenty of people back then that would have said, the only good Moabite is a dead Moabite, something like that. Don't prejudge others, whether it's a person or groups. Remember, somebody said, can anything good come from Nazareth? I think maybe it could, don't you? And I've had that kind of thing go against me. I'm not sure if I've told this story here, but often I think about when I was building a house and the guy who was lead carpenter on our house tried to get a concrete finisher to come and work on my garage floor. The guy wouldn't do it without advance check because he said preachers don't pay their bills. I said, well, this preacher does. Still had to get an advance check, but don't tell me I don't pay my bills because some preachers don't. That's not true. Don't prejudge others. The other thing is, do not presume you know God's judgment. That's what Naomi was doing. She was apparently saying, well, some things bad happened to me, so it must be God's judgment. There's all kinds of things. When she gets back to Bethlehem, you're going to find next week that there's going to be tongues wagging. Look at Naomi. Wow, she's 10 years older. Hadn't been using her makeup, has she? Because she doesn't look too good. If she'd only stayed home, everything would have been fine. If she'd been faithful, God would have blessed her. See, that's what happens. Husbands, sons die. Well, that's the way tongues wag sometimes. And that was true then, and it's true now. There was a pastor in New England a long time ago who was not an eloquent speaker. His church didn't grow, but he loved the Lord and he loved his people. He had a child that was stillborn, and someone said, well, it's his fault. He was outside God's will. Look, his church didn't grow. Well, that wasn't true. We need to know that we should not presume to know God's judgment. We do that. Some people say, well, the poor deserve to be poor. They should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And I guess my question is, well, I wonder if they really have any bootstraps. Some people probably do fail to work. Some people I've known are lazy and they don't have enough. And that's true that the poor, you might say, in some ways deserve it. But there are plenty of people who work hard and just have a hard time in life. They lose their job because of layoffs or because of COVID or whatever it is. And we need to understand that we don't need to decide that someone who's poor deserves it because they're lazy, because they may not be lazy. We don't need to decide that someone who has a failed marriage should have done better. Maybe they did the best they could. They should have been more dedicated. Well, maybe they should. But we don't need to be presuming God's judgment. And then finally, God is working in the whole picture. In Naomi's story, we're going to find out later, even though she thought God's hand was against her, his hand was working in the whole picture. The hand of the Lord may have seemed to be against her at the time. But if she'd stayed in Bethlehem, Ruth would not have been David's great grandmother. That's just the truth. And who knows how history might have changed in some other way. Well, let me just spend just a few more minutes with you. In our first session, we said there's 4 big ideas that we want to look for in the book of Ruth. And you can see the 4 on the screen. I won't take the time to read all of them. But I think the one we see here is that God's hand is present in apparently natural events. Whether it's the famine, and I'm not saying God caused the famine, but he's still working. He's still there. Whether it's the famine or the time when they could come back to Jerusalem, he's working in all that. I should have said Bethlehem, but he's working through all of it. And then in the practical and theological lessons, the 2 that I see here that are underlined on the screen, God will not let his promises to Israel and Judah die. Israel and Judah and David die. And then also God works in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform and his goals to achieve. God does work in mysterious ways. And then we had some others that you might have in your notes from last week. I don't believe we've come to those yet in the study of Book of Ruth, but I'll put those on the screen just in case. But I do want to share with you a poem that I think is applicable to this lesson that we need to know. Remember, a life that is pretty as a picture? Well, the lessons I think we can learn here are: do not prejudge others, whether it's one person or whether it's a people, a group of people. Don't presume you know God's judgment. You may think you do about you, or you may think you do about somebody else, but you're not God, and I'm not either, and we don't always know. And then also, remember, no matter what, God is always working in the whole picture. Here's a poem I want to share with you that I think applies to this lesson. It's by an unknown author. My life is but a weaving between the Lord and me. I cannot choose the colors. He worketh steadily. Ofttimes he weaveth sorrow, and I in foolish pride forget he sees the upper, and I the underside. Not till the loom is silent and the shuttles cease to fly shall God unveil the canvas and explain the reason why. The dark threads are as needful in the weaver's skillful hand as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern that he planned. And if you think about a tapestry or the underside of a quilt top or whatever you want to think about, you know that the top side is beautiful. But on the bottom side, you see the threads. You see the imperfections. We need to remember that God's working through all of it. And we see the problem, and he's working anyway. I hope that's an encouraging word to you, wherever you are and whatever you're doing. I hope that you are encouraged by that. And I also hope that you'll take care of yourself, take care of your family, and take care of your church family. Good night, and God bless.